Welcome to the 2 Acre Homestead Podcast. I'm your host, Lisa. And on today's episode, we are going to be discussing how to cook from scratch. And we're really going to be taking a deep dive into this subject. Welcome to the 2 Acre Homestead. Come along with us on our journey from a small suburban homestead lifestyle to our new lifestyle, homesteading in the rural countryside of southern Arizona. We'll share with you our tips, tricks, successes, and failures from both our past suburban lifestyle to our new rural lifestyle, all on the 2 Acre Homestead. Well, you guys have me solo today, and that is because Kevin, my husband, my co-host, is busy on let's just say he's got something going on here on the homestead, and he cannot do the podcast with us, but we will be getting into what he's doing a little bit later in the season. We will be revealing that. So, exciting stuff. There's always something going on our homestead. So here recently, we have been getting ourselves ready on the inside of our house, believe it or not, instead of focusing on the outside. I have managed to overcome some of my garden failures and have been taking those failures and making successes out of them. But that is for a different episode as well. I'm sorry to string you guys along, but that's a different episode. But we've been taking those failures and making successes, and now we're just waiting for everything to come into harvest season. So that's exciting. And so we've been focusing more on getting our pantry organized, getting some things organized here on the homestead, taking care of some projects that we have going on, getting ready for to get goats onto our property, and also getting some things better organized here inside the home. So that's a little bit of what has been going on here on our homestead. And we've just been busy as most homesteaders are. Well, let's get into cooking from scratch, because I know that this is something that for many of you it can be daunting. It can be just like a really big subject unto itself. And it can be very intimidating. And when I was thinking about this particular podcast, I had to think about how I started cooking. And to be honest with you, truth be told, I started cooking back when I was 8 years old. Now, you might be sitting in your car or doing whatever you're doing, listening to this podcast, and you might roll your eyes. But the truth of the matter is, both of my parents worked full time. I was the youngest of my siblings, and there's a very large age gap between me and my siblings. So it's kind of like I was raised by myself. And so I started learning how to cook because when I came home from school, I was hungry. And if I wanted to eat something, I had to learn how to put it together. So I started cooking at a very young age. But as the years had progressed, I really got into the mode that everybody gets into, where you go out to eat, you're, doing all this other stuff. When we started honing in on homesteading and started really making that our focus, that was one of the first things that I had to start learning how to do, was cook from scratch. Cooking from scratch can really save you financially. And especially if you learn to cook from scratch the way that I am going to teach you. So let's get into it. The first things first is you want to break up your food groups. Now, I'm not talking about the way that the government breaks up the food groups in the, food triangle, whatever they call it, they break up all the food groups like that. No. This is something very different. And for me, it has worked over the years. So I break up my food in this way: wheat, rice, beans, vegetables, milk, and meat. Those are the food groups and food items that I always make sure I have almost a year's supply, if not more, in my pantry and or freezer at all times. I'm not talking about for a specific season. I'm saying at all times, you need to have a year's worth of those foods in your pantry or freezer. Why? Let's just take the first one, for example, wheat. Whether you buy your wheat as a flour or you choose to buy the wheat berries. Myself personally, I prefer the wheat berries because they last longer. That's a personal choice. Whatever you decide, wheat, having that on your shelves and having close to a year's worth of wheat stored up in your pantry gives you the ability to not just make bread, but there are other things that you can make with it. You can make bread, you can make pie, you can even make noodles. You can make pasta with it. You can make the normal, regular, like cookies and blah, 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 things like that. Anything that uses wheat or flour, if it's something that you and your family like, use that, and even if it's like a one-off thing, let's say you like to eat Gillettes with your coffee, or you like donuts. Well, you know what? If you've got the flour on your pantry shelf, you can go ahead and make those specialty items without having to feel the need to go out to the store to buy them. So it's really important to have that because that gives you flexibility. It gives you the ability to pivot in your kitchen. The other thing, you can make roux and stews and thickeners with wheat. You don't have to buy something to thicken it. You can use the natural ingredient wheat to do that with. Another example is milk. Now, I say just milk because once you have milk, once you have dairy in your refrigerator, once you have that stored there, again, it gives you flexibility because if you have milk and it's either raw milk or just pasteurized, not ultra pasteurized, but just pasteurized or raw milk, guess what you can make? You can make butter, you can make cheese, you can make yogurt, you can make cottage cheese, you can make sour cream. Do you see where I'm going with this? You have the basic ingredient. So take the things that you like. This is just my list. These are the things that I know the basic ingredients that my family likes. And from these basic ingredients, I can make practically anything that my family likes with these basic ingredients at any given time. Now, when it comes to having a year's worth of that said item, now we're getting into the question of, well, how do you store all of that food? And maybe even a more basic question is, how do you buy that, especially if you're on a tight budget?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Are you looking to build a homestead from the ground up? Or maybe you're looking to build an off-grid dream home, a vacation home, or maybe just a piece of land to call your own. Visit yourcheapland.com to buy rural land in the wide open spaces of southwestern United States. When you visit yourcheapland.com, they're here to help you, and with their help, you can do this. You can take your dream of owning land and make it a reality. Most down payments are only $294, including the document fee. Remember, everyone qualifies for financing at yourcheapland.com. Head on over to yourcheapland.com and start making those dreams come true. And now, back to our podcast. My answer to that has been and has always been and always will be, you need to have multiple ways of gathering food for your pantries and freezers. There is not one way or one shoe to fit everything. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, oh, well, just buy a little bit here and a little bit there. And, if you know you like, garbanzo beans, I'll just use that as an example. If you know you like garbanzo beans, buy whatever you would buy normally and then buy one extra. And you keep doing that week after week. That is one way to build a pantry. But let's stick with legumes for just a minute. If you're going to buy a can of beans, financially, it's cheaper for you to buy them raw. Not the canned, but the dry, raw beans. Then from there, you can either learn how to can them yourself or cook them the way that people did 30 years ago. Cook them, put them on a slow cook, and you put them in your crock pot, soak them the night before, put them in your crock pot in the morning, and away you go. And in the evening, you have beans. That might be one of the easiest ways for you to build your legumes. The other way to build and to have extra things in your pantry, another way of doing it is you pick farms. I can't tell you how many times we've been to you pick farms in our area, and you see people here and there. Sometimes they'll buy just a little bit here and there, but you can oftentimes get food that you've harvested yourself at those farms for pennies on the dollar. And if you don't know how to can, you don't know how to dehydrate, we're going to discuss that in a minute. But if you don't know how to do those type of things, that's okay. Do you have a freezer? Take those things. Go to a U-Pick farm, get a couple of bushels of tomatoes. Get a couple bushels of pickles, or not pickles, cucumbers. Get okra. Get whatever it is that they're letting you pick at that particular farm, and learn how to preserve that food, because you're getting it pennies on the dollar. Another source is farmers markets. And don't be afraid to walk up at the farmers markets and ask them, especially I would recommend that you do this towards the end of the day when they're just starting, they're thinking about closing up. Go on, approach them and ask them if they'll give you a discount because they're getting ready to close up. What are they going to do with all of that produce? Where's it going to go? Ask them if they could sell that to you at a discounted price. Do not be afraid to ask for a discount. Another tip, I used to do this all the time when I was buying raw milk. Now that's a whole different discussion, but when I was buying raw milk at the grocery store, sometimes I would look for the milk that was closer to the expiration date. And a lot of times the store would give me a discount because it was close to the expiration date and it's raw milk. They want that stuff off their shelves. But here's the secret. Raw milk doesn't really expire. It just becomes something else. But again, that's a subject for a different podcast. But having my point in this is knowing your food, knowing if this thing expires, will it go bad? Is the best by date really the best by date? Can I get a discount if I buy something closer to a best by date? Knowing how to ask for a discount, how to get those discounts, and not being afraid to put in a little bit of work and effort into getting some extra food on that table of yours and in the pantry. So that way you're not in this desperate need to rush out to the store to get something. You have everything that you need. You have those core ingredients that you use to make any meal possible. Again, let me just repeat that. Those core ingredients, whatever that looks like for you and your family, those core ingredients, whatever they are, have a year's worth. Know how to ask for discounts, know how to put in the work to obtain those core ingredients so that you can put those on your shelf and you will always be able to cook something from scratch. Something. Now, again, like I said, I gave you my core ingredients, which is wheat, rice, beans, veg, milk, and meat. I can do anything with those. You notice legumes are not high on that list. They're not even on here. Not legumes. I'm sorry. What I was thinking about is, I'm sorry. I was thinking about something else. Beans are on the list, but there are certain beans that we don't like. And when I say beans, for my family, we like kidney beans. We like chickpeas, but pinto, meh. Black beans, meh. If we don't have those type of legumes, we'll survive. They're not high on our list, but kidney beans are very high on our list. Chickpeas, very high on our list. So know what your family consumes, know what they like, and you can cook anything. Now, the other thing is, since this is a podcast about homesteading, for the love of all that is holy and sacred, please cook what you grow. I know that seems like a foreign concept, or not a foreign concept, but a crazy thing for somebody to say. Because you would think, well, all that effort that you put into gardening, wouldn't you want to cook what you've grown? But believe it or not, things can get lost in that big box that's sitting in your kitchen called the refrigerator. Things can get buried, things can get lost. Be sure to cook what you grow as quick as possible. As soon as you possibly can, cook what you have grown or preserve what you have grown as quickly as you possibly can, because you do not want to waste any food that you have produced on your homestead. Because in essence, even if you've spent a lot of money up front, creating a garden and doing soil amendments and things like that, those things cost money. But over time, what winds up happening is your food becomes free, because the cost of the food versus the cost of the soil amendments and everything like that to cause that food to grow, it eventually cancels itself out. So you are, in essence, growing free food. So do not waste free food. And if you can't consume that food for whatever reason, because let's be real, life happens. And sometimes your garden can produce more food than you know what to do with. But, try to preserve all of the food that comes from your garden. But if you can't consume it or preserve it, then make sure that food goes to your animals. Because we all know when you're on a homestead, you're also growing animals, right? And the animals can turn that into food for you. And if that doesn't work for you, then simply compost it down so that it can create more soil for you. Cooking from scratch, it takes work. It takes time. And I know for most of you, this is probably not what you want to hear. But at the end of the day, you are choosing, when you're choosing to homestead, you are choosing a harder road, so to speak. And cooking from scratch goes hand in hand with homesteading. I would dare to say that you can't even really be a homesteader without cooking some of your food from scratch. It just, it doesn't make sense. You have to be able to cook from scratch. Sometimes, if not all the time, it requires planning. Ladies, if you're like me, I'm a creative. There are some days I just can't go by a plan. I have to go based on how I feel. And so having a meal plan and saying, well, on this day, we're going to have spaghetti, and on this day, we're going to have chicken tacos. Yeah, it's just not going to fly with me, because I may not be feeling like making tacos on that day. I may just want a homemade pizza and a salad. Is there anything wrong with that plan? But no, there's not. But try as hard as you can to meal plan. And if you're like me, I know myself personally, I don't write down the meal plans necessarily, but I do have them in my head. I know that day I'm going to be doing this, and I know on this day I'm going to be cooking this. I kind of have a rhythm of life as far as what I cook for my family. I know typically, like for me, typically the first half of the week is usually going to be some sort of Spanish food, some sort of Mexican food. Usually by the middle of the week, we seem to go Asian. And then by the end of the week, it is American fare, whatever that may be and whatever is in season. That is my rhythm. If you're like me, like I said, you're creative, try to at least find a rhythm. Now, if you're not like me and you like to have things planned out, you are probably a step ahead in this area. Sit down, write down what you're going to eat, what your family is going to eat. This gives you the opportunity to meal prep. This gives you the opportunity to say, okay, you know what? I need to chop up all of the veg that we're going to eat for this week. Or I need to have this prepared and that prepared so that way when it comes time for me to cook a meal, I can bring all of these prepared ingredients together for an actual meal. So when you cook from scratch, try your best to be organized. And if that doesn't work for you, then try having a rhythm that you can follow. The other thing that is going to help when it comes to cooking from scratch is knowing how to preserve your food. Now, I've talked about this a little bit already here in this podcast, but let's go a little bit deeper. If you have the budget for it, I highly encourage you to learn how to can. Canning, especially meat, is probably the most, oh goodness, I would say that's one of the easiest things that you can do. I know a lot of people want to can jellies and jams, but frankly, I'm going to steer you kind of away from that, if at all possible. And the reason is for the input, for the time, energy, effort, you get more bang out of your buck by preserving meat, high protein in cans and making that shelf stable than you do jellies, jams, and fruit preserves and all of those kind of things. It's better for you to preserve the meat because meat is more expensive. Jellies and jams and everything else, that's not as expensive as meat. It takes time to grow the meat. That was a living animal, and you don't want to waste that product. So by learning how to can and learning how to put that up in your shelf, it's better energy wise and it's better financially speaking. So there is an upfront cost to when it comes to canning. If you have an electric stove, I highly recommend any sort of canner will really do. Just know the All-American 921, if you have a glass top canner, or a glass top cooktop, glass cooktop, do not use the All-American 921 on that because it's extremely heavy and it could break the glass. So you just want to, just kind of do your research, do your homework as far as canners are concerned. But there is an upfront cost to that. Plus you need the glass, you need the jars, you need the lids, and really try your best to learn by reading. I highly recommend, it's the National Center of Home Food Preservation. It's online. I will put that in the show notes below, a link to that website. That is the safest way to can, is based on their recommendations. I would follow their recommendations to the letter, and do not skimp. Do not what they call rebel can, which means canning things that are not recommended. Don't do that. Don't do anything like that. stick to what they recommend, and how they recommend canning. There are also some good books. The Blue Ball canning book also has a good, it's a spectacular book on canning. So I'll put some links below in the show notes for some good resources for you guys for canning, because I think it is something that is really important for you to do. Freezer meals and learning how to freeze your food correctly is also something that's equally important. And again, referencing that National Center for Home Food Preservation website, they also discuss that. They're not just about canning, but they also discuss other ways of preserving your food. Freezing your food, knowing how to freeze your food is very important. There are some vegetables that you need to blanch first before you freeze them. So, really learn how to preserve your food by freezing. And also freezer meals. Let's discuss that for just a hot minute. Freezer meals, I absolutely adore them, because when you have been just running ragged all day long and you just don't have the time to cook from scratch for whatever the reason is, being able to open up your freezer and say, I'm going to pop this homemade meal into my freezer that I've pre-made myself is comforting, because you know all of the ingredients that went into that meal. And that is actually the theme of being able to cook from scratch, is that you know precisely what's in there. Why? Because you've gone back to the basic, you're making something based on your basic foods that you can combine to make whatever meal you're interested in making. A couple other things, and I'm kind of sad to leave this at the end, because these are actually my favorites, and that is dehydrating and fermenting. I'm a huge advocate of fermenting food. It is one of the easiest ways to preserve food. And I know a lot of people will say, well, it takes up a lot of room in my refrigerator. But, back in the day, and I'm talking way back in the day, like 1800 back in the day, they didn't have refrigerators back then. They didn't have a means to keep food cold unless it was in the wintertime. Then, all you had to do was stick it outside. They didn't have that back then. So when they preserved their food by fermenting, they tried to keep things in a root cellar, someplace where the temperature is going to be a little bit more stable. But this day and age, I'm willing to bet that most of us have some sort of area that's a little bit cooler in our home. Not cold, but cooler. Somewhere like in your pantry where it stays nice and cold. I know our pantry has tile floor, and I can put fermented food on that tile floor and it will stay nice and cool. So find a place in your home where it can stay cool. I'm willing to bet most of us have air conditioning. So, you're probably going to be able to keep your house a little bit more temperate and find that little area where it's cooler. Even a basement works. If you've got a basement, you can keep that fermented food on the shelf. You don't want to go past 6 months. And if you think about it, when you're fermenting your food, at least back in the 1800s, when they were fermenting food back then, they were only doing it to preserve it from one season to the next. So 6 months would be the maximum anyway. But having that fermented food is keeping all of that good bacteria in your body, and it's really feeding you good food. And it really helps you with your digestion. It helps you with your immune system. Fermented food is probably the best thing you can do for you and your family, is to ferment it. Dehydrating is also a fantastic way to preserve your food because you're taking out the moisture, and water really breeds disease. I shouldn't say disease, but it can breed bacteria. And so by removing the water from your food, that is a way of preserving it. Now, when it comes to dehydrators, it's, you can go the really high-end dehydrators, or you can go, your simple little Nescos, the little round circular ones. But when it comes to dehydrating, I strongly recommend that no matter what you get, always make sure you have one with a temperature gauge on it, whether it is digital or dial. It needs to have a temperature gauge on it. Why do I recommend that? That's because when you start dehydrating herbs and things that are a little bit more fragile, the higher the temperature, the more you're going to burn it. And you're going to take away all of the good stuff that's in those herbs. So really make sure you have a dial gauge on there. I'm not a huge fan of freeze drying. I shouldn't say I'm not a huge fan of it. I do like freeze dryers. I like the idea of them. And I do believe that it is a simpler way of preserving your food. But if you're not consuming food that, if a lot of your food is not already freeze dried, if you're not already buying a lot of freeze dried food, then honestly, just think about how you're using it. And think about what your goal is with a freeze dryer. Because, excuse me, if you think about it, with the freeze dryer, you need to rehydrate that. It's the same with a dehydrated product as well. You need to rehydrate it in order to eat it. But if that is the only means of, or the primary means of your food preservation is freeze drying your food, and something happens where water is scarce, and I'm sorry, I live in a desert, so I think in these terms. If water is scarce and you can't use a lot of water for one reason or the other, having the bulk of your food requiring you to use liquid in order to consume that food, that can become a problem. That can become a problem really fast. So, think about freeze drying. I know everybody's rah, let's go get a freeze dryer, but think about it. Think about what your reason behind that is, and think about and play out in your mind, what if water was scarce? And I know that may sound a little bit strange to some of you because it's like, water being scarce. But to those of us that are on the western side of the United States, water is scarce, believe it or not, for a lot of people, and especially those of us who live in the desert. So we really have to think about that. Just really mull that over. But being able to take your core ingredients and bring that into a meal, and having those core ingredients, a year's worth of those core ingredients on your shelf, will benefit you and your family. And being able to sit down and plan out what you and your family are going to eat for the week, or at least getting yourself into that rhythm, that is also going to help you cook from scratch. My final recommendation, in addition to preserving your food, is purchase books that teach you not only how to preserve the food, but good cookbooks, books that teach you how to cook from scratch. Books that don't just promote, or blogs that don't just promote, let's use Betty Crocker, or, I don't know, whatever brand it is that they're trying to push. Look for books, look for blogs that teach you how to cook with core basic ingredients that, don't have a laundry list of things added to them, just core basic ingredients. And once you've learned how to do that, you can pretty much do just about anything in your kitchen. And this will help you also with inflation, because you are now in control of your kitchen. At least for a year, you know what your family is going to be able to eat. Well, I hope that this particular episode has helped encourage you to cook from scratch. I know it can seem like a big subject and a big thing to do, but believe you me, once you start learning how to cook from scratch, you will never want to go back. Well, that's it from me and my family here on our little homestead. So from all of us to all of you out there, happy homesteading and stay safe out there.